Hi, class. If you are watching this, you are here because you are interested in learning about the history of the American West during the Reconstruction era. In this video, I will explain to you how American government would interact with, or how it would encourage the exploration to the West after the Reconstruction period, as well as some of the consequences that this is going to have on the people who live there already. And the reason why I say this is because every time I teach American history, I tried to dedicate some space for Native American history too. And in this lecture specifically, we're going to look at some of the developments in the Western frontier that will took place after the American Civil War. Because, as you shall see, there would have been many attempts of people trying to migrate west, be it out of the sense of adventure, be it out of the sense of or looking for profit. And the specific years we will study are from the 1870s through the 1890s. And we will study how during those decades, how migration to West is going to impact the lives of Native Americans who have lived there for centuries. Now, historically speaking, hang on, I'm trying to get my keyboard. I'm sorry for all the noise, so I can switch the slide. I should have been ready for this. Anyways, historically speaking, American West has been imagined as this space of freedom, of excitement, of opportunity, so many things we don't know about the West in the 1800s in America yet. So after the American Civil War, many Americans will turn their attention to the, I guess, unfinished business of settling the territories in the West. And if you look at the map, you will observe that American government already controls portions of the West, and we are formally referring to these as territories, meaning that we understand that they are ours, they are in the possession of the American government, but we haven't yet added them to the Union or haven't yet added them to be formally part of the states of America. And if you look at the map on the slide, you see we, for instance, have territory of Montana, Dakota, Nebraska, New Mexico. So all of these territories you see marked in this darker shade of yellow. Now, interestingly, on the map here in the left corner, you also see the territory that, it's not geographically located here, but for the purpose of this slide, it's kind of like all the way up here, right, where Alaska today is. But before it was actually American and before it was actually Alaska, it was referred to as Russian America. Of course, again, today, this is the state of Alaska. But Russian America, as it was called in the 1800s, has actually been part of the Russian Empire since the 17th century, so since the 1600s, when it was conquered by Russians. But American government will purchase that territory from Russia in 1867 for 7.2 million US dollars. And in today's money, that's approximately 150 million US dollars. And America is interested in this territory because we want to, of course, expand. We are looking at natural resources we can have from Alaska. And the Russians are interested in selling it to America because Russia at the time in the 1860s was struggling economically. And, Russians will fought some wars in Europe at the time. I will not worry you with that, but just know that the Russian government needs money to wage wars, so they sell their Alaska to America. Anyways, aside from acquiring Alaska, many capitalists, many company owners will want to move to West because it was general knowledge that these territories in yellow are rich in natural resources, but are still fairly, economically underdeveloped. We don't have factories there. We don't have big farms or big plantations there. We don't have big mines. So let's see how we can invest money. And we start that process by sending people to live there, because we think that these are the primary locations for capital investments. But before we study how this developed, let's briefly have a short overview of the general history of the Western expansion. And very important term that we associate with the movement of people to West in America is something called manifest destiny. Now, I'm sure in your past history courses, you may have heard of the term before. You may even know what it means to believe in manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is basically idea shared historically by many people who lived in America, according to which settlers, so people who move from place A to place B to permanently live in place B, have this natural and divine right to occupy the entire continent of America, because they see themselves as being on this divine mission to expand the borders of America all the way from Atlantic to Pacific Ocean. So this idea of manifest destiny was something that was planted in minds of Americans since almost entire American history. There's always been curiosity, even since the early colonial times, and colonizers exploring the West or moving west to see what's out there. And as they move forward with the expansion, they thought that it is their God-given right. So this idea has religious undertones. It is our God-given right to have the space and to occupy it for American government. And historians like to use that term to explain this migration of thousands of pioneers, investors, farmers, entrepreneurs, who for decades, even of course before the American Civil War, would be just simply packing up their stuff and moving to the West because of the hopes of financial prosperity. And in fact, since colonial times, since America was a colony by different European countries, so throughout, say, entire 17th century, if people were migrating west, they will do so, yes, but they will be individual people. So there isn't like a government-sponsored program to tell people, oh, if you go, we will subsidize it for you, or we will give you money because we want to finance you, right? So you will have individuals, farmers, profit seekers, and they will take this trip to West at their own risk, understanding that they are not yet regulated by the American or colonial governments. Then by early 1800s, by 1803, you may know that during these years, American President Thomas Jefferson had purchased a large chunks of land in the center of America, previously known as Louisiana Territory. These were the territories in possession of the French government. You see them marked as this light yellow color in the center of America, in the middle of America. And you may also know that European leader and Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte would have sold the Louisiana Territory to then American President Thomas Jefferson for $15 million. And these territories, again, were previously owned by France, but they were now in possession or under control of the American government. And we think of this act of this so-called Louisiana Purchase as a representative of, or as being a first government-sponsored action to actually acquire the lands in the West. Following that story, if you fast forward a few decades later, American government will add to its control the remainder of the territories stretching all the way from the Gulf of Mexico, starting with Texas, all the way to the Pacific with states or future states like California and Oregon. And America will come into control of these territories after the so-called Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. So this conflict happening a few decades before the American Civil War. And during the Mexican-American War, it was basically fought over a dispute between the government of Mexico over where the border between America and Mexico is supposed to be. With America, of course, winning the war, and with America winning the territories you see in darker yellow I just mentioned. And those territories used to first being Spanish colonies, then those territories belonged to the government of Mexico. But after the Mexican-American War and with America's victory in it, America is now in control. Then if we were to plug this story back with chronology of the class that we are supposed to focus on, if we were to fast forward to things happening in the 1860s, we see a more systemic effort by the government encouraging migration to West with the goal of actually populating these territories, because we understand we are in control of them, but what good use are they to us if we don't have people living there and making profit for the American government? So by 1862, so that's like at the early stages of the American Civil War, American government is going to pass the so-called Homestead Act. And we think of the Homestead Act almost as the extension of the Manifest Destiny. So it's like an actual Manifest Destiny if we were to put it in a public policy action. So this is going to be the law. The Homestead Act is a law passed by American Congress, according to which every American citizen, as far as he is male, or if you are a woman and you are single or widowed, you have the right to acquire up to 160 acres of land in the West by simply marching to the West and by simply staking a claim. And automatically everything surrounding you that is of those 160 acres will automatically be in your hands. However, there were some rules in how you can get to official possession or how you can get the title to own the land. The settler could claim official ownership, according to the Homestead Act, of these 160 acres, either by, number one, living on that land for a minimum 5 years. And after the 5 years that you had been there, lived there, you would automatically receive the title that says you are the owner of this land. Or number two, if you wanted to become a property owner instantly, you could buy the land for $1.25 per acre. And then, of course, you would get that deed of ownership instantly. And either way you look at it, either with plan A, living there for 5 years, or plan B, buying it for $1.25 per acre, it is a very cheap price or a very easy way to get a lot of territory. And the idea was that, maybe following this concept of Manifest Destiny, American settlers who would purchase this land or who would live on this land would be improving it. Developing the land by maybe, plowing the fields and starting farming business, maybe build houses, build barns, maybe digging up wells and, have access to water, or in general, trying to promote agriculture and through the process expand economy in the region as well. And of course, hundreds of thousands of people would take advantage of this super opportunity to be landowners in the West, such as a number of families that you see on the slide. We have a woman homesteader living in West Minnesota, picture on the left from the 1880s, as well as the family moving to Nebraska in heart of America in 1887. Now, while those families traveling to these sections of America would eventually profit from being the property owners, we may pause and ask ourselves, what is the potential bad side effect of many people moving to the West? So what can potentially go wrong, right? We may stop and think, well, potentially maybe families would start to feel unsafe and attacked by others. But specifically, I want to focus on what happens to either the environment, and number two, what happens to the people who lived there first. So people who already had occupied that territory. And by these people, of course, I'm referring to the Native Americans, right? So next point of our conversation will be to explain how this massive migration of people to West will impact environment of the West, as well as the lives of Native Americans. If we think of the impacts on environment, the colonization to the West will lead to a large-scale slaughter of different kinds of animals, specifically bison. Bison are the largest mammals of North America, extremely profitable animal for many different reasons. And hunters who would move westward will, of course, want to make quick profits off of killing bison. Specifically, we talk about states like Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Kansas, Dakotas, North and South, that are homes to the largest population of the American bison. And hunters and profiteers in those areas will kill bison for numerous reasons. Number one, you have leather, which was extracted for the purpose of clothing industry, shoe industry, leather for purses. So basically like a fashion purpose. On top of that, if you kill a bison, you can also have meat. So bison was also used as a source of food. And on top of that, you had bison skulls that were used as a fertilizer in farming. So you could, take the skull of the bison, you could grind it, and you can use it as a soil fertilizer. So when we think of bison, we think of an animal that historically has been absolutely capitalized, meaning every single piece of the animal has been taken a look at and considered how we can profit from that piece of an animal. In this overkilling of bison, and given how profitable bison actually were, as you can imagine, will lead us almost to a natural disaster, almost a near extinction of the species in America, of course, bison species. And by 1870s, and specifically by 1880s, the number of American bison will plummet, meaning it will decrease from over 10 million bison living in America to only a few hundred bison found in America in the 1880s. So again, almost near extinction, almost near environmental catastrophe because of the search for profit. And the records or evidence that we have from this history are, of course, numerous photos, like the one you see on the slide. You see a pile, a mound, a mountain of bison skulls. You see two guys standing on top, I guess just for the perception of how large or how tall that mountain of bison skulls actually was. And you also are assigned to read a primary source for this week. In American Yap, chapter 17, I think that is the chapter on the American West, you have the words of William T. Hornady, who explains how Americans had exterminated or nearly exterminated the American bison, and he lists his reasons as to why he thinks that happened. So as you embark on this week's quest of learning more about this topic, you will specifically read an excerpt from the expert on the topic of the bison extinction. Moreover, as I said earlier, having an impact that's devastating on environment can be bad, of course, but perhaps even bigger problem, arguably, maybe sorry if this is opinion based, but maybe even a bigger problem than environmental issues. When the migrants came to occupy the territories of the West, most of them will also wish to ignore the fact that they were not the first ones, nor the only ones who will want to live in this territory. Because, as you know, this territory, of course, was a home to hundreds of thousands of Native Americans who will suffer greatly as a result of the westward expansion. There are many examples of this history. I will only bring up one today. We're going to look at the situation in the territories of Idaho and Oregon, one of the westernmost states in the northwest regions of America. In these territories were a home to Nez Perce Native Americans. And generally, if you think about the ways of life of Nez Perce, they were simply like peaceful bands of people. They didn't want conflict. They didn't want wars. They didn't want to argue with the American government. Instead, a lot of them will simply just want to leave voluntarily. So they will just want to escape this situation and escape from having to even interact with white settlers or with having to deal with American government. So they will say, well, just let us go, right? And the chief of the Nez Perce was a person named Joseph. And in 1877, he is going to make an attempt of leading his people. He said, we're going to pack our stuff and we're going to move to Canada. So it was like a over 2,000 miles journey to escape to Canada. However, this escape would not be successful because Joseph and the people that were traveling with him, who were the members of Nez Perce, they will be captured by the members of the American military, and they will be put into reservations. So at the locations specifically designed for Native Americans to live in and for American government to have like a level of control over the lives of the Native Americans. And following this incident, he is going to appeal to American Congress. He will try to construct laws that would secure freedom and equal rights for Native Americans. I thought that on the slide, I have the copy of the words of Chief Joseph. I unfortunately don't. I guess I forgot to copy paste it, but I will add the document onto the blackboard so you will see what the words of Chief Joseph were when he pleaded to the American government to not force them to leave and what his demands would be. And you will read more about this in the document that I will attach under course materials and under additional primary sources. Until then, we may start to make assumptions about how the American government would respond to the plea of Chief Joseph to let his people leave America peacefully. So in this plea, he will just say, we don't want to hurt Americans. We tried to assimilate. We weren't good enough. So what are we supposed to do next, right? We don't want to live here. Just let us go. And how do you think American government would respond to this quest? And the answer to that is they will not really respond very fondly. And nearly all of the officials of the government will believe that federal government should force Native Americans to surrender not only most of their land and territory, but also to give up the traditional Native American ways of life, and that they had to assimilate or to I guess what would be the equivalent of the word assimilate or the synonym for it? You're basically trying to force people of a different culture to look like you, to think like you, to talk like you, and to forget your ancestry and to simply disband it, right? And the government agency responsible for this process, for the process of assimilation, was the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And they will become increasingly busy trying to suggest different kinds of policies or of what kind of policies should be passed to affect the lives of Native Americans living in the West. And one of the first policies that they will pass was a policy from the 1970s with the establishment of the so-called boarding schools. And if you look at the two different pictures on the slide, I may not have had the most perfect explanation of what assimilation is or the policy of assimilation is with my words, but maybe the pictures that you see on the slide can speak more than the words themselves. Because on the picture on the left, we see a group of young Lakota boys. Lakota were Native American people who would have been impacted by the policy of the boarding schools or having to go to schools. On the left, we see them wearing their traditional clothing, their traditional hairstyles, their traditional shoes, jewelry, feathers. You could look at them and make a conclusion that this is a Native American group of boys, right? And then you can look to the right, and these are the same boys after they had been put in the so-called Carlisle boarding school in the state of Pennsylvania, right? So on the left, this is how the boys looked like upon their arrival, and to the right, this is how the boys looked like after they had spent some months at the Carlisle school in Pennsylvania. So we want the children to abandon their language, to abandon their culture, their religious observances. We want to put them instead to American-led schools or schools led by the American government to teach them English, to teach them what we think is the proper religion, to teach them what we think is a proper way to dress and to represent and to present yourself to the world. And that is kind of obvious from these pictures. And aside from these pictures, you will learn a whole lot more on how exactly Native American education looked like from the primary source that you are reading for this discussion for this week as well. I think they are the words by a woman named Laura Kellogg, who was one of the educators at one of the boarding schools and who will start to express her concerns about what is so troubling of what she calls, quote unquote, Caucasian education, and this assumption that, only if you're white, you know what the adequate course of curriculum is supposed to be, or how, what the knowledge is supposed to look like, and how that view is actually false, and how boarding schools are damaging for the Native American cultures. As we continue to have a conversation about how the westward migration would impact lives of Native Americans, we also want to address the question of, or the problem with the Native American citizenship. And we have learned in the lectures past that the 14th Amendment grants the rights of citizenship to newly freed African Americans. And it also specifies that every person who is born